And we're back. If this represents one sugar, monosaccharide, what do you think the technical term for sucrose is? Not monosaccharide. Disaccharide. Good. And what do you think we call it when we add a sugar and another 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 sugar, and you get this long chain of sugars? Polysaccharide. Good. So that's where this idea, and these are terms, again, that you can look on a bag of Cheetos at the dietary information, and you'll see terms like mono-di-polysaccharide. Sometimes they'll say simple, like one, or complex carbohydrate, meaning a bunch of sugars. Good.
What is the glycosidic linkage?
Great question. I've been on the fence about talking about this. When you have smaller units combined into larger ones, especially with this dehydration reaction where you're creating this weird new bond by removing water, usually they are given names. And a glycosidic linkage is kind of the terminology we use to describe the bond that would hold these monomers together. When you bond amino acids together, that bond that holds the two amino acids to one another is called a peptide bond. So we have these kind of, it's just a covalent bond. It's the name we give to that covalent bond, just because it's such an important, it's a bridge between the two. Now, notice there's a 1,4 and a 1,2 glycosidic linkage. What do these weird numbers mean? What are the numbers referring to?
Spots on the molecules.
Which carbon atoms on those different molecules the bonds are between? But that is not something that I want you to write down, or I won't ask you about these numbers. But just understanding that they reference carbon atoms in a numbering system that chemists use, it can make it less scary. Okay. So a few pictures here. This is a plant cell. Plants have kind of a boxier shape to their cells. Inside this potato cell, which is the plant it comes from, you can see these little bubbles, and these are just structures in the potato cells that hold what we call starch. And starch is just a whole bunch of glucose stuck together in a chain that can be thousands of glucose molecules long.
Starch is a polysaccharide.
Starch is a polysaccharide, yep. Why do you eat a potato? Why would you eat a potato?
Because they're good.
They taste really good when you put a lot of lipid on them, like some butter and some bacos and sour cream. By the way, why does a baked potato taste better than an uncooked potato? What does the baking do? What does that thermal energy do?
Heats it up, making it like softer.
It does. It makes it softer. It makes it taste kind of, I don't want to say sweeter. You wouldn't think of a baked potato as being sweeter, but it tastes more pleasant than biting into an uncooked potato. But do you know what the heat when you cook typically does to save the polysaccharides? What is heat going to do to a bond sometimes?
It's going to break it.
Yeah, it breaks up the bond. Cooking potatoes actually breaks some of these long chains down into smaller sugary chains.
Oh, so like the starch will become glucose and...
Yeah, now, it won't go that far, but, well, it might. In some cases, you might have individual little glucoses come off. But your body can tell that it's more available. You're going to have an easier time getting the individual sugars out of it. And again, your brain is rewarding you. Now, we eat some carbohydrates that we actually cannot break down. And cooking them doesn't affect the bonds that hold them together. And that's the case with cellulose. And that's a term I would write down, cellulose. I would be familiar with this idea of cellulose. Cellulose is the same thing as starch in a lot of ways. It's a bunch of glucose molecules all bonded together in long chains. But you have kind of these multiple chains that are woven together, and it's a much, much stronger kind of structure. You cannot digest this, but you eat it when you eat plant material, because plants use cellulose for all sorts of things. In fact, you're writing on cellulose right now. It's the big thing we extract from trees to make paper. And you can eat paper, if you're wondering. But I wouldn't. Now, they make these fibers that provide a lot of structural support for plants. In fact, wood, the construction material we get from trees, is basically these fibers just compressed year after year as the plant makes more and more of them. So they're very strong. But you still eat them when you eat spinach and lettuce and any plant material. What do we call it? What's the everyday term for when we get cellulose in our diet? They recommend you get a lot of cellulose in your diet.
Fiber?
It's fiber.
Oh.
When they say fiber, they're literally referring to these fibers that the plant makes out of this cellulose material. And while you can't digest it, it does kind of help push things on through.
Oh.
Cellulose is also used to make the cell walls of plants. This is a plant cell. And plants have these really thick, strong structures around them called cell walls, which we will talk more about later. But they're very important for the cell. And they're also made up of these polysaccharides. They're made up of cellulose.
So they'll put fibers in yogurts to...
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the fiber is when they add fiber. Like a lot of foods you buy that say like, oh, this is high fiber. They add that fiber in. And it's some sort of just, processed plant material that they use. That's cellulose. But I don't know how they get it, what they do to extract it. They just dry out unwanted plant material and pulverize it into powder and just mix it in or what. But yeah, they have all sorts of fiber supplements like that. Okay, this is really more of what we were talking about. I mean, now that we've discussed it, you can see things like the ring structures of glucose. Glucose actually comes in two different, very similar forms, where kind of an isomer here, where you have kind of a different positioning of some of these groups. Like here, the hydroxyl group is kind of positioned in a downwards manner versus an upwards manner. Little differences like that matter. Do you know what these symbols mean?
They're variants?
This is the Greek A and Greek B, which are called what?
Alpha and beta?
Alpha and beta. This is called alpha glucose and beta glucose. There's not a lot of... I wouldn't really write that down, honestly. Your book will refer to it. I won't ask you about alpha beta glucose molecules. They don't come up on the AP exam, or they might be referenced, but it's just glucose. The reason I mention it is that these tiny little differences is what can kind of give a lot of diversity to a lot of these types of molecules. So starch versus cellulose, the difference is basically, is it all like this one isomer of glucose, or are you alternating kind of alpha beta glucose molecules? And that makes a difference between, say, you know, a potato that you can digest the starch out of, or the leaves of a plant that are less starchy and more fibrous. So something that's not on these slides that you should know is basically, why do we need carbohydrates in general? What are they going to do for living things? Give me some examples from what you've seen and what you know already. Why eat them?
Because they give you energy.
Energy,
They're releasing into glycogen.
which is energy. All of that. So one reason you eat them is for energy. Small sugars are really good at giving you immediate energy. And polysaccharides, when you put a bunch of these small sugars together in large chains, those are good for energy storage, which in a plant is kind of how starch is used, even though we steal that when we eat it. And we don't make starch in our bodies. We use what? What was the term you used? With the G?
Oh, the glycogen.
Glycogen, good, yeah. Glycogen is kind of animal starch in a way. So quick energy, energy storage, and then for plants with the cell wall and cellulose, plants actually use these polysaccharides for kind of a structural, for a building block, a structural component. So knowing kind of what they're for is also important. Mainly though, for us, it's all about energy. That's why you eat carbohydrates. So, we're going to move on to lipids. I might not finish all these slides, but we can wrap them up next time. Let's talk for about 5 more minutes, because I want y'all to have a chance to look at the AP classroom problems. This is a pretty simple molecule of fat. Now look at all of those atoms. I don't think anybody would look at a molecule like this and say, wow, that's so simple. Fats contain a lot of atoms, but if you look at this molecule, what are the only 3 elements you see?
Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen.
Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbohydrates. Now, to make a fat molecule, or to make certain types of fat molecules, lipid molecules, you typically are going to take what's called a glycerol, and then these larger, long molecules that we call fatty acids. And in this case, we have what's called a triglyceride, a very simple fat. And you'll see how they can get much more complex and weird. But essentially, this glycerol molecule has these 3 hydroxyl groups. And how are we getting the fatty acid to stick onto the glycerol?
Water.
We remove water. It's a dehydration reaction. You just take out an H and an OH, remove the water. That creates an availability to make a new bond, which we can see here. This is the result of that, where this fatty acid is now directly bonded to the glycerol. And again, like with the glycosidic bond, we have a name for that. We call it an ester linkage. But I don't care about those specific bond names.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there shorthand for like the fatty acids, or do you always have to write it like that?
That's a great question. There are ways, a lot of times they might show you have this kind of zigzag chain, they'll literally just draw like a zigzag line.
Okay.
And you'll see that. Because of the huge diversity of fats and how different they all can be, there is less of a easy shorthand that's like always used. But don't worry. I might give you this picture and ask you if it's a carbohydrate, fat, protein, or nucleic acid. And that's the kind of question I like doing. But my God, I would never make you draw all that from like memory or something. That would be cruel. What's that? Yeah, it would be. It would be bad. So this is just kind of the same thing you just saw. I just wasn't sure how easily you could see it from the projector and all. So again, you see this dehydration. But I want to point out, you're not making a polymer here. This isn't a bunch of the same thing getting bonded together. So while it's still a dehydration reaction and you have pieces coming together to form a larger molecule, this is technically not a polymer because the individual pieces you're bringing together aren't all the same monomer, or roughly the same. They're very different molecules that just happen to be kind of put together to synthesize a fat. But it's still a dehydration. There are two major types of fat. They are listed on dietary information on any food product that is sold in the United States. One of them is called a saturated fat. Do you know what the other one is?
I wonder what.
It's an unsaturated fat. I think somebody said that. And to your point, Willerson, this is kind of as much shorthand as you're going to get. The glycerol molecule, and then this little like carbonyl group here, and then just instead of drawing out the long chains, they just make these zigzags, which literally means single bond, 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 and it could go on for, I don't want to say forever, that's not possible, but for dozens, hundreds of carbon atoms. Now, saturated fats, what makes a saturated fat is that in these long chains that come off a fat molecule, it's all single bonds. I know you see like this double bond to this oxygen, but we're talking about the tails that come off a fat molecule. These are all single bonds in saturated fat. For a reason we'll see in a second, when you have all single bonds, the molecule is much more compact.
So you know how it's called like polypeptide chains and amino acids?
Yeah.
What are the chains and lipids called?
The fatty acid tails.
Fatty, oh.
Yeah.
And then for carbohydrates, the chains, it's not the chains, but
It's just a polysaccharide chain. You don't even say chain, you just say polysaccharide. That just means it's many in a chain.
okay.
But saturated fats only have single bonds in these long carbon tails that come off of them. And since they only have those single bonds, the molecule takes on a very compact structure. And since each molecule is kind of compact, they can pack together pretty tightly. And the result is typically, at room temperature, a solid. And so butter is kind of your classic example of something that has a lot of saturated fat. I know you might say like, well, if I leave butter out on the counter all day, it can get soft and you'll get a little oil come out of it and all that. And that's true, but butter is a more solid type of fat because of the saturated fats. Now, when you see what an unsaturated fat is, with unsaturated fats, you can get just a little double bond somewhere. And that's what this diagram right here is. It's a double bond. And because of VSEPR theory, which some of you got into in chemistry, but because of how double bonds work, it actually causes these kinks to occur in the fatty acid tail. And when these tails get kind of kinked like that, they're not as compact. So they don't pack together as well. And so at room temperature, you have what? Typically a liquid instead of a solid. That's right. And that's really what I want you to know. The unsaturated fats have some double bonds. The double bonds cause them to be less compact. And so something like olive oil here is going to be more unsaturated in nature. And typically will be more of a liquid form. Okay, I have 1, 2, 3 slides. I'm going to zip through them. We're going to spend 1 more minute. I'm going to do 3 slides. Come on, I can do this. Come on. A phospholipid is something we will talk a lot about in a unit or two when we get into cells. But basically, a phospholipid is a lipid. Here you see the fatty acids, these long tails that fats have. And on one end, or on the opposite end from the tails, you simply have what? Why is it called a phospholipid?
Phosphate.
You have a phosphate group, one of these side chain groups. I mean, one of the functional groups that we talked about. So a phospholipid is one kind of fatty molecule that has tails, fatty acid tails, and then what we call a phosphate head. And a lot of times in your book, they shorthand, they just do like a circle for the phosphate head, and then just like 2 little lines coming off of it to represent the tails. And, you know, your book goes into it a little bit. These are very important for the for certain cell structures. I would certainly read about them, but I don't want to spend too much time right now. The next slide is associated with them. Again, a phosphate group with fatty acid tails coming off. The phosphate group likes water. So you've seen this term in your reading, hydrophilic, water-loving. Fats are, as you know, water and fat doesn't mix. And the fatty part of the molecule is water-fearing, hydrophobic. So this is a weird molecule where one end of it likes water, the other end of it doesn't like water. And so when you put it in water, if you put a bunch of phospholipids in water, they arrange themselves in this weird way where all the heads kind of go towards the water and all the tails are repelled by the water, and you get what's called a phospholipid bilayer. 2 layers of these phospholipids. I know I'm moving kind of fast through this, but we're going to spend a little bit more time on all of this stuff as we review and answer some AP classroom questions. And then finally, I just want to show you, why did it not change slides? There, good. Thank you for catching up. This is a cholesterol molecule. And the reason I'm showing you this is to kind of just point out how incredibly diverse these lipids can be. There are no real tails here. I mean, there's a little bit of like a carbon tail pointed out by this zigzaggy pattern here. You have these 4 big kind of atomic rings that the core of the molecule is based on. It is considered a lipid. It is by no means a simple molecule. And this specifically is cholesterol, which again is a component in food. This is a very important molecule for life, especially in the animal world. We'll get into its function later. It's in a whole group of chemicals known as the steroids, which is a term you've probably heard before. There are many, many types of steroids, and cholesterol is one of them. So these lipids can be very unusual. But typically, and this is the last thing I'll say, what is the reason to eat fat? What do lipids typically do for you in terms of a dietary function?
Storing.
It's energy. Again, it's energy, calories. And they're great at storing that energy. But they have a lot of other uses that we'll be getting into. So I'm going to stop it there. And if you want to stop the video. That was a lot, guys.